Nearly 10 years after JonBenét Ramsey was murdered, it suddenly looked like the case actually had a real suspect. There was a man who was living in Thailand, John Mark Karr, who had been sending emails about the case under the name Daxis. And the emails, he was talking like he knew her, like he was there, like he'd been carrying this emotional weight for years and he just needed to confess to it. And so he was arrested. And when he was brought back to the US, he told reporters that he was there with JonBenét the night when she died. So naturally, people thought, this is it. This is the guy who did it. But when investigators actually started checking through his story, it began to unravel pretty quickly. And what looked like this breakthrough just turned into something just strange, really, just weird. So how does he come into this?
Murder, cults, kidnapping.
Where the trail goes cold, we keep digging.
This is Dead Ends.
So this all starts with a man, Michael Tracy, and he was working at the University of Colorado. He was a journalism professor, and he'd made documentaries about the JonBenét Ramsey case. And in 2005 into 2006, this man, Daxis, as he was calling himself, starts emailing Tracy. And the emails weren't normal. It was just really intense, emotional, strange emails. He was writing like he was someone who had been personally involved in the case and in JonBenét Ramsey's life. It wasn't just someone who was interested about the case and seemed to be claiming just to be involved for the sake of it, but he was talking about sort of this grief and this darkness and this separation that he'd felt as a result of the case. At one point, he described her as the love of his life. Just really disturbing emails that didn't sound like they could be ignored. And obviously, alarm bells started going off for a lot of people because it's not just a fascination with the case anymore. It's someone who's specifically trying to insert themselves into this case, into the investigation. And from what was reported at the time, investigators did take the emails seriously. You'd have to. And that was partly because he included some details which were a little less known about the case, but also specific details about the layout of the house, the basement, things that you might have known publicly. But there were details about the $118,000 amount that was laid out on a table, the staircase in the house, the layout of the basement. And it's someone who clearly knew the case really well, so had to be taken seriously. And, you know, we look back and it seems really obvious that this guy was just nonsense, you know, when you look at it. But at the time, you just can't dismiss this thing. You can't dismiss what this guy's saying because it seemed like he really, really had this depth of knowledge, this emotional connection, which went beyond just an obsession with something external to yourself, but something that you're actively involved in. And so eventually we moved from these emails to actual phone calls. So Tracy, Professor Tracy, and John Mark Karr, they spoke multiple times on the phone discussing the case. Again, just really, he's just a creepy guy, like just an absolute obsessive, weird guy. And then finally, law enforcement were able to trace one of the calls and they found him in Thailand working in a school. Really worryingly, he'd been working in schools for a long time. And at that point, he becomes an active lead. He is arrested and he's brought back to the US. And obviously, once this becomes public, because it's such a big case, because there's so much interest, just the story, the media storm around it explodes. You've got this former school teacher who's living in Thailand talking in this really like weird, obsessive, eerie, emotional way about JonBenét. He was saying he was with her when she died. He's saying all these details, and it's quite easy to see why at the time it does sound like actually they've got the guy. It sounds like a confession, not some just vague, weird person, but an actual confession. And so obviously the media are running this, but this is where the case starts to fall apart, when people actually start looking at the facts of the case and what he's saying. Does that align to the actual evidence? Does that align to the forensics? And it turns out it did not. So one of the biggest reasons was he was claiming he had drugged JonBenét before carrying out all these horrific acts. And so on the surface, that sounds really specific. That sounds like, okay, this guy knows what happened, but it just didn't line up with the evidence. So when they looked through the autopsy, the blood screening showed there were no signs of drugs or alcohol in her body. And although there were small abrasions on the genital area, there wasn't any evidence of male semen found. So straight away, we've got these facts that he's saying, that he's drugged JonBenét, that he's done all these things, and it's just not lining up with what the autopsy is actually showing. And that, obviously, this is where the problem starts spiraling, because if someone's confessing, if they've got all these facts, then they should actually line up to evidence. Or it's just a story, Are they just taking the details they think they know based on what's publicly available and mixing that with their own story to make it sound believable? And it seems at this point, that's more likely what's happening as investigators are looking at it and as they're looking at this evidence in line with John Mark Karr's story. And so he also reported that he'd picked her up from school. He picked JonBenét up from school and brought her to the basement that day. But again, it was just a weird claim because it just didn't fit with the case. This was Christmas. So, she wasn't in school, and investigators knew that she was killed inside the family home after she'd been in the family home. That was known. So again, you've got this really dark detail that he's describing. He took her from school, but it's not actually lining up with the really just basic facts of the case, So you start asking, can you actually place him there? Was John Mark Karr in Boulder that night? Can you connect him to the Ramsey's house? Can you prove he had actually any real world link to JonBenét that's not just the facts of the case that are publicly known after the fact? And obviously, again, his story starts to collapse. So Karr's ex-wife said that during Christmas 1996, the year JonBenét was killed, the two of them were living in Alabama, and she was with him throughout that whole period. So again, what he's claiming about the drugging her and what he did to her, that's not lining up. What he's claiming about when and where he took her, and then the progression of events from after he took her, doesn't line up. And then you've got his ex-wife saying, actually, he wasn't there. He was in Alabama at Christmas with her. And obviously, people can lie. They can be mistaken. People can quite easily slip away, and that can be forgotten by people that they were with. But mixed with the forensic evidence not lining up, mixed with the timeline not lining up, it just is really starting to unravel and look really unlikely. And so prosecutors even said they found no evidence placing Karr at the scene. And the DNA evidence they did find there was some blood in JonBenét's underwear. It didn't match John Mark Karr. And so investigators are looking at this and they're trying to look for something that ties him to this crime, but it's just not happening. It's just not lining up. And prosecutors again are saying they're not able to establish this at all. And so the case against him just unravels. That's the prosecutor saying that. And that just shows how unlikely it is. This is just him talking. This is an obsessed man with a story who is trying to insert himself into the case. And obviously that is still creepy. It's just a weird thing to do. But it doesn't necessarily make him a killer. He's trying to incriminate himself. He's got this obsession with the case, but DNA doesn't line up. The timeline doesn't line up. His claims about what he did don't line up. He's got an alibi placing him not at the scene of crime, which usually people are striving to have, but in this case, he is wanting to be implicated. We've just got this man who is really, really obsessively trying to confess, trying to make this grand, emotional, tragic story. And that, I think, is all he's trying to do. He's got this obsession with JonBenét, clearly, with this case, and he's just trying to craft this saga around himself, so perhaps so he'll be remembered in history. I mean, we can't really analyse his behaviour specifically without expertise, which I'm not, but it does seem that he's just trying to craft himself into this story, perhaps to be remembered, perhaps it gives him some weird, just creepy satisfaction. Whatever his motive, it's just not lining up with truth, though. And the thing is, a lot of the things he comes up with is based on things that were publicly known. So obviously, he's really sounding really detailed, really specific. He's sounding like actually he has this depth of knowledge around this case. How does he know this? But it is all based on things that you can find out that were accessible. It's such a public case. So much is able to be discovered, and he's clearly obsessively gone into that so he can build a compelling argument. He's found a person to communicate this with, Tracy, Professor Tracy, who's already interested in the case. He's a journalist. He's interested in these things. Obviously, journalism has good groundings many of the time, but why would you not want to be the man who discovered the killer? He's picked someone specifically who he will be able to have this conversation with, to build this persona. And then once he gets caught, to try and build depth into that persona. But the evidence is the thing that just turns him in for not being the killer. So is he a disturbing person? Yeah, definitely. He's just obsessively linked himself to this case. He's a really troubling person. You know, he's got this unsettling behavior, but does that make him the killer? No. And that's the part that matters when we're trying to find the truth behind a specific case. Obviously, this man has something up with him, and that's important. We can't dismiss that. But when we're asking, is he involved? It just doesn't line up. He gave a version of the crime. He gave us all a story, but investigators were able to separate that from reality and say that actually this doesn't line up. So does it tell us that John Mark Karr, Daxis, was creepy, unsettling, perhaps psychopath? Probably, yes. But it just doesn't tell us who did murder JonBenét Ramsey. And so it's a strange man, but it doesn't give us the answer to that. But who do you think is responsible? I mean, there are a lot of different suspects. Who do you think did it? And why do you think John Mark Karr was so obsessive with inserting himself into this case? What do you think his motivations around that were? I mean, this seems to happen in a lot of cases where people try and insert themselves into the investigation. They'll actively tell police they did it. Why do you think people do that? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear your comments on what you think the motivation behind this is. And if you've got this far, please hit the like and subscribe button. We'd be very happy about that. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you at the next Dead End. Goodbye.